Kennedy came to realize that he was trapped by his advisors and that the only two people that could save the world were himself and Khrushchev, even facing down their own advisors. And they reached an agreement, of course, one that was only publicly understood decades later because the agreement was a compromise, it was diplomacy. It was that the Soviet Union would withdraw its missiles from Cuba and the United States would withdraw its missiles from Turkey. And of course, Kennedy, and I always say, don't complain about someone who saved the world, but he did make it a little complicated for us afterwards because we didn't understand it was a compromise. We thought it was a showdown that Kennedy had won, a game of chicken that he had won. But in fact, it was a diplomatic compromise, and it saved the world. But that 1 second away from disaster that I mentioned is a story that we only came to know roughly 40 years later, and it's told in detail in Sherwin's book. And that is the story of the disabled submarine on the bottom of the Caribbean, out of communication with Moscow, out of communication with the world, and in trouble, disabled, with a breakdown of its system so that the heat inside had risen, if I remember correctly, well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Sailors were keeling over, and they did not know what to do because their orders were to remain submerged. So the captain finally decides that they have to rise, not knowing what is above. And this is observed by the US Navy nearby, and a Navy plane swoops by, and a real jackass on the plane wanted to have some fun, and instead of dropping depth charges, he dropped live hand grenades on the submarine, thinking that this was fun. And the captain decided that they were under attack and that there was a war underway on the surface. And it happened to be the one submarine in a squadron of 7 in the Caribbean that was carrying nuclear-tipped submarines, nuclear-tipped torpedoes. So he ordered the torpedo bay to be filled with this nuclear-tipped torpedo, and gave the order to fire. It happened that on this one submarine, which was the lead of the squadron, there was one party official who was senior to the captain. And he countermanded the order. He said, I don't think we should fire, we should surface. That is what saved the world. That was after the agreement was reached between Kennedy and Khrushchev. That was 2 days afterwards. Kennedy had a famous line that there's always one son of a bitch that doesn't get the message about people not following orders or going off course. This was somebody who didn't get the message because they were in a disabled submarine. But under US nuclear doctrine in 1962, any attack by any nuclear weapon was called upon to unleash the full nuclear arsenal of the United States. By the way, not just on all targets in Russia, but in all targets in the, quote, communist world, China, Central Europe, Eastern Europe. You were there. My wife in Prague those days. Anyway, it didn't matter where you were because we learned 30 years later that everyone would have died from the nuclear winter, no matter not the 700 million that our policymakers had rationally concluded would be the desired outcome of this strike in retaliation. And don't think that it wouldn't have happened because the head of the nuclear forces at the time was none other than Curtis LeMay, and subsequently made famous in Dr. Strangelove. And we've had a lot of true unstable, dangerous people in power, and he was one of them, and no doubt would have seen through this order because he considered Kennedy a traitor, and basically said so in open insubordination, that Kennedy was weak and soft and was afraid of attacking and was holding back the attack on Cuba. We also know, by the way, incidentally, that every bit of intelligence about how many soldiers there were, which missile systems were already installed, what would have happened, were all wrong, because the CIA rarely gets anything right from what I've observed in the last 75 years. And this was yet another case of the CIA getting almost everything wrong. Well, that brings me to the speech, because Kennedy had saved the world with Khrushchev, and they both deserve the credit for saving the world, because Khrushchev was also an outstanding human being. And in fact, though he had this harebrained idea of putting missiles in Cuba, when he told Gromyko, his foreign minister, of this idea, Gromyko said, "What do you want, war?" And he said, "War? No, nothing to do with war. This is to show the Americans a little bit of their own medicine. That's all, just to put their nose in it, not war." And that really was Khrushchev. He was a man of peace. And so Kennedy and Khrushchev in 1963 entered a kind of peace tango during the year, and Kennedy was determined to pull the world back from the brink. And he was, in 1963, he was certainly the greatest president and statesman of the post-war period. It was a year of true political genius of Kennedy. He grew to something absolutely, something we had not seen since Franklin Roosevelt, and to my count, almost never in American leadership. He became a great, great person. So when we remember him as great, sometimes the historians say, "Oh, not so great. He didn't pass his legislation and so forth." He was great. He saved the world, and he brought the world back from the brink of nuclear war. And in doing so in 1963, he had an incredible insight, which is for us so important. And his insight was that to make peace, it was the United States and the attitudes in the United States that were the most important challenge that he had to overcome. His speech on June 10, 1963, which I've made my family listen to at least 75 times, so I ask each of you to listen to it at least once, because it's mesmerizing. The commencement speech at American University is a speech directed not to the Soviet Union, not making threats, not saying how tough we are, not saying we will never back down, but a speech to the American people saying we need to understand we can make peace with the other side. And think about this, he's saying this 9 months after the Cuban Missile Crisis. It would be like Biden going on television tonight and say, "You know, we really need to make peace with Russia right now," which he should do and will never do. But it's like that, only much more so, because this was the height of the Cold War. Incidentally, in writing that speech, he and his closest counselor and magnificent speechwriter and advisor, Ted Sorensen, kept the draft secret from all the bureaucracy until the final weekend, because he knew the Joint Chiefs would try to stop it. The intelligence community would try to stop it. The State Department would try to stop it. And he wanted to speak straight to the American people. So the speech is something unbelievable, and you heard some words about it. What kind of peace do we seek? Not a pax Americana, not not the peace of the grave, but the peace that makes life worth living. And he told the American people, we need to understand the other side are human beings, and they love their families like we do, and the Russian people are filled with valor and filled with heroism and filled with culture and science, and that Russia experienced devastation in World War II, tantamount to the complete destruction of the United States from the Atlantic to Chicago, and explain to the American people that other powers will also observe treaties if those treaties are in their interest as well, so that we can actually negotiate a treaty with those people. It's unbelievable. Not one demand of the Soviet Union, not a word of bluster, really an appeal directly to the minds and the hearts of the American people. And he explained so many things. He explained what leadership is. He said, by defining our goal of peace more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly toward it. So he wanted that goal, and he wanted to make it tangible, and for him it was the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty that he wanted as the first concrete step of drawing back from the brink. And he explained that there's no magic solution to peace. He said peace is a process, a way of solving problems. And this is also magnificently wise. And in my favorite lines of the speech, he said, so let us not be blind to our differences, but let us direct attention to those differences and to the means by which they can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air, we all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal. Well, when he gave this speech, Khrushchev received it, received the translation, and immediately called the U.S. envoy, Kennedy's envoy to Moscow, Averell Harriman. And he said to Harriman, this is the finest speech by an American president since FDR. I want to make peace with your president. 5 weeks later, they signed the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. 60 years ago. And Kennedy had the most magnificent words about it. This is your second homework assignment. His speech at the UN General Assembly on September 20th, 1963. Because there is Kennedy at the rostrum and all the world leaders in front of him and all the world leaders listening to him. And he says, you know, this does not end our conflicts, this does not end war, but the clouds have lifted a little bit. We can see a ray of sunshine passing through the clouds. And he ends the speech by saying that Archimedes is said to have told his friends, give me a place to stand and I can move the world, in explaining the principle of the lever. And then Kennedy looked out at the world leaders and he said, my fellow citizens of the world, let us take our stand here, in our time, in this place, and see if we can move the world toward peace. Well, there was rapture in the room there was peace for that moment on the planet. And of course, they killed him a few weeks later, probably for this initiative, because it was most likely rogue agents within the US government that did this, probably from the CIA, in my judgment after studying this for 40 years. But Kennedy set us on a path that did not end with his death, though Johnson had none of this insight and spirit and humanity that Kennedy had. Kennedy was really something special, and especially in that last year had reached absolute global greatness. But what Kennedy had set in place was a process towards stopping the nuclear arms race. It was a very hard and tortuous process, of course, but the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1963 set the stage for the Non-Proliferation Treaty just a few years later. Without the first, there could not have been the second. And it was actually Kennedy's game plan. Of course, he hoped to negotiate the Non-Proliferation Treaty as the follow-up treaty to the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. And then, despite all of our horrible mistakes in this country, in the Vietnam War and the destruction of Southeast Asia, the bombing of Laos and Cambodia, destruction of Vietnam, and so many other horrible blunders, there did come the period of nuclear arms control talks and détente, and the beginnings with the SALT Treaty, and then follow-up treaties to begin to get this under control. And of course, when Kennedy spoke and gave the peace speech, he estimated, his advisors estimated, that there would be 30 to 40 nuclear nations within 25 years. And successfully, that was limited, not successfully enough, but limited to the 9 nuclear nations today, much less proliferation than was expected. I think it's notable that Kennedy set a process in place that lasted roughly 30 years, and it created the basis for détente and for nuclear arms control, and eventually a basis for Gorbachev to make giant steps forward in peace. And I came into this story a little bit myself professionally as Gorbachev came to power, because in those days, for an economist, watching the reforms of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe was really something quite special. So I got to see Gorbachev's Soviet Union in motion in 1987, 88, and in 1989, Gorbachev helped to engineer basically the end of the dictatorships in Central and Eastern Europe. By the way, just worth mentioning, because great people need to be appreciated. I advised the first Polish government after the communist era, and helped them with their economic strategy, and helped them actually with the political strategy, from going from the Solidarity movement to the elections that took place in June 1989 to forming the first government. So I got to watch that process with very high clarity. And one day, one of the lead dissidents, now famous and heroic person named Adam Michnik, if people know him, he was one of Lech Wałęsa's top advisors, and has been editor of the main newspaper, free newspaper in Poland for the last 34 years. I called him and said in July 1989, a month before the transition to the post-communist government, and I said, how are your negotiations going? He said, Jeff, you know who I just spoke to on the phone? I said, no. Gorbachev. Gorbachev called me. Gorbachev called the dissident advisor to Lech Wałęsa. And Gorbachev said, you people should join the government. You should get in the government. I'm going to talk to Jaruzelski about that. So Gorbachev helped to create the coalition government that came into office in August 1989. He was a magnificent man, Mikhail Gorbachev, the greatest statesman of our age. And he had an idea that we could have an era of peace. And he called it our common European home. And he talked about a common home stretching from Rotterdam to Vladivostok. And I believed it, and believe it till today, that that was the right approach. And Gorbachev asked me to join his economic team, which I did, and my job was to try to help raise some emergency financing from the US government to help a tottering Soviet economy that was in a profound financial crisis. And I had learned from John Maynard Keynes in the 20th century that you help countries in crisis so that they don't turn around and create crises later on. Keynes had warned against the harsh Versailles Treaty in 1919, worrying that it would bring to power in the next generation some horrors. And he, of course, was prescient in that. So I believed the same thing. I found that the US was completely immovable in any kind of help for Gorbachev, any kind of financial help at all. Gorbachev, of course, fell from power in that putsch in August 1989, and Yeltsin came to dominance in Russia. And Yeltsin's economic advisor, who became Prime Minister, Yegor Gaidar, asked me to help. So I got to watch that a little bit close up. And what Yeltsin said to me on several occasions in 1989, we just want to be normal. We want to be a normal country again. This is very compelling. And I explained in my full innocence, President Yeltsin will help. You know, maybe they couldn't understand to help the Soviet Union. That was just a leap of imagination too far for the American leadership. But a new post-communist Russia, of course they're going to help. Have no worry, I said. And of course, there was no help at all that came from the United States. I won't belabor at this late hour anyway, all of the dreadful missed opportunities. But the mindset of the US then was something that I would only come to understand over the following 30 years. So this carries us 30 years from Kennedy. Now I want to carry the next 30 years briefly, if I can. Basically, the United States could not take yes for an answer. In 1989, 1991, 1993, we had peace at our fingertips for the world. We had cooperation with Russia, completely possible. We were the world's sole superpower, the indispensable nation, Madeleine Albright told us. But we couldn't take the idea of peace seriously, because it was in that moment that the new crowd came in and took power. The ones that are in power until today, because it's been pretty much a continuous 30 years of what I think we can call the neocon ascension that started in the mid-1990s and that continues in power today. And if there's one constant, if you want to see the face of that, it's our Deputy Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland. She's been everywhere. She's been Cheney's advisor. She's been Bush's ambassador. She's been Hillary Clinton's advisor. She's now Biden's she was under Secretary of State. Now she's Deputy Secretary of State. Now, what couldn't they take yes about? They could not take yes that we could have a normal, respectful relationship with Russia. And after China's rise, that we could have a normal, respectful relationship with China. Because the project of the new American century, of Mr. Robert Kagan, Victoria's husband, and the project of this group, and basically it's the project of the military-industrial complex as well, the ones that are just as happy to be part of this, is that the United States needs to dominate the world in order to have peace, not just cooperate with the world. And this is the fundamental hubris and the fundamental assertion of power that has brought us to where we are today. We are not in danger because Russia was hostile, nor because Putin was hostile when he became president. Russia was not hostile, and Putin was not hostile. And Putin was not dreaming of reconstructing the Russian Empire or whatever little bit of silly propaganda we get fed each day. Russia wanted normalcy, wanted respect and normalcy. China would like respect and normalcy. Instead, we decided to surround Russia first and then China now with our military bases all around their borders and to flood the space with our military power because we are the indispensable nation. So rather than Kennedy's message, let's look inside and understand we can make peace with the other side, which even in the height of the Cold War succeeded, even when we had peace on our platter, when they had ended all claims and conflicts, we couldn't accept that. So as people probably know, in 1990, James Baker III, our Secretary of State at the time, and Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the Foreign Minister of Germany, solemnly promised to Gorbachev repeatedly during 1990, NATO will never move eastward. By the way, you no doubt read all the time that this is false, but it's true. And there's a long archive of materials demonstrating, which I'd be happy to send to anybody, or you can just look it up at the George Washington University National Securities Archive. To make an interesting but long story short, starting with President Clinton, starting with the project for a new American century, really starting with the neocons in the last year of the Bush administration, with Wolfowitz and Cheney and Rumsfeld, but then taken on because it's basically the military-industrial complex by the Clinton administration in the mid-1990s, championed by Madeleine Albright and Richard Holbrooke. NATO enlargement started. So we couldn't take peace for an answer. Rather than disbanding NATO, which would have been an absolutely plausible and right thing to do, we started to enlarge contrary to our promises. 3 countries expanded in 1999, Hungary, Czech Republic, and Poland. But then came George Bush, and we went on NATO expansion on steroids, so that in 2004, 7 more countries joined NATO: Romania, Bulgaria, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Slovakia, and Slovenia. Now you have the Black Sea, and you have the Baltic states. And our idea was surround Russia, maybe break apart Russia. That would be nice. decolonize Russia, as it came to be called, was the neocon idea. And the Russians, I know them, they kept saying, would you stop? You told us nothing. No expansion, not an inch eastward was the line. Now you're in the Baltic Sea, you're in the Black Sea, you're in the Baltic states, you're in the Balkans. What next? Well, George W. Bush Jr. gave them the next in 2008 when he faced down what was pretty good sense by the Europeans and insisted that NATO commit to expanding to Ukraine and to Georgia. And this was fulfilling a plan of Zbigniew, that if we could surround Russia in the Black Sea region, we would end Russia's power, essentially, power projection in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. And the Russians were saying, this is impossible. We're never going to allow ourselves to be surrounded. This is our naval fleet in Sevastopol, which you read about each day, is our attack of missiles and a HIMARS bomb Sevastopol today. We're not going to allow that to happen. And in the meantime, under the same project, not only did we do that, but we unilaterally abandoned the anti-ballistic missile treaty, which was certainly the single most destabilizing act since Kennedy's partial nuclear test ban treaty. It ended up unraveling all of the nuclear agreements because the United States said, we'll put missiles where we want and when we want them, and it's nobody's business. And of course, we put the Aegis missile systems into Romania and Poland over the vociferous objections of Russia, and that, as much as anything, is why we have the war in Ukraine today. So we could not take yes for an answer. And the Russians kept saying, stop. Well, Ukraine elected a president in 2010 who said, this is getting too hot. We'll be neutral, thank you. Thank you, we'll be neutral. That was Viktor Yanukovych. Well, that drove the neocons crazy. So they knew they had to overthrow him. And when the opportunity arose in February 2014, Victoria Nuland was our point person to overthrow Yanukovych. And it was a violent coup stirred by the United States. I happened to see some of it close up. It was quite ugly. And some of you, probably all of you, have heard Victoria Nuland on tape 3 weeks before the violent events describing who would be the next prime minister. Very weird, very unpleasant. We have a way of not discussing any of this in this country, by the way. So not any of this background has been discussed by the New York Times in its coverage of this crisis during this whole period. I can tell you because I complain to them almost daily. And my fantasy is canceling my New York Times subscription after 60 years, but I can't bring myself to do it. All I do is just read it with disgust, but we still subscribe. In any event, this is what has brought us to where we are today. We have unilaterally abandoned all of the nuclear agreements. Others have expired. Others we never were willing to ratify, like the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. It's been 30 years when the United States said no to peace. So for 30 years, we dug out of the Cold War from 1963 to 1993. And from 1993 to 2023, we recreated the Cold War. And we're in two hot wars today because of this hubris and this arrogance. It is not because Russia is an implacable foe. It is not because Putin is a vicious megalomaniac dreaming of recreating the Russian Empire. These events never had to take place. The United States has rejected every opportunity to negotiate, including two that people should understand. One was December 17, 2021. Putin put on the table a draft U.S.-Russia agreement to avoid a war. It said NATO will not enlarge to Ukraine. I called Jake Sullivan and said, Jake, you better negotiate. It was the one and last time he took my call. And I spent an hour trying to describe why there was one way out of this, and I've seen this for 30 years, and we're making a big mistake, and it's time to negotiate. Well, the U.S. gave the formal response to Putin on January 26th, I believe it is 2022, when they said, NATO expansion is none of your business and it is non-negotiable. That's our official policy, that U.S. expansion of NATO to Ukraine is literally none of Russia's business. So we do what we want, and we expect that this is going to lead something desirable or to our security. And of course, it leads to exactly the opposite. I won't keep you longer, except to say that China, the situation with China is the same. We decided 10 years ago we need to contain China. Good luck with that. The main trading partner of virtually all the world, the low-cost provider of most of the key green technologies that the world needs, a country that has made stupendously successful and impressive efforts to escape from poverty that itself was largely caused by the outside world, by 2 opium wars, by the extraterritorial claims of the European and US powers, by the Japanese invasions. And they escaped from poverty, and instead of a nice word, every word is bad-mouthing China. He's a dictator, he's a this, he's a that. Again, we can't take yes for an answer. We have to seemingly create the enemies, to have our enemies, and to expand our military everywhere. We were just in Australia, we were in Taiwan a couple of months ago. That's the Ukraine of the coming years if we continue on this policy. We say we'll arm you to make you safe. If we send arms to Taiwan, we will make them the bullseye, believe me. It's the stupidest thing in the world we could do, would be to arm Taiwan the way we're talking about doing. And it would be the most suicidal for them to accept it, but they probably will. It's hard not to accept that. That's what Ukraine discovered too late. We have your back. Right now, ladies and gentlemen, we don't have anybody's back, not even our own. We don't have Israel's back, we don't have anybody's back. The world has changed so much that we can't keep anybody safe. We can't even keep the American people safe the way we're going. The world does not abide by our foreign policy. The world does not accept NATO enlargement. The world does not accept what Biden said or did in the last 2 days in Israel. The world sees things in a different way. They don't want one hegemonic power. They want political solutions. They want a Palestinian state. So do I. Why not after 60 years of this? So they understand that this is about politics. They understand it was not a good idea for the U.S. to push NATO to Ukraine and to Georgia. They understand it was not a good idea for Nancy Pelosi to fly to Taiwan, that doesn't make Taiwan safe, that makes Taiwan endangered. That's how the world sees this. So let me speak 1 minute about the next 30 years. We had a good 30 years that President Kennedy started, not good in every way, but good in the sense of beginning to get this nuclear demon back under control. We had another 30 years of American hubris that has brought us to war and geopolitical tensions that are unrivaled since the height of the Cold War, and according to the doomsday clock, are even worse than during the Cold War, because we add also the environmental catastrophes that are on our doorstep at the same time as the geopolitical risks that we face. So we never before were 90 seconds to midnight, not even in the Cuban Missile Crisis. But what we have seen is it's possible to change course. This is, as we say in economics, this is endogenous. This is not something that comes from the outside. This is a choice for us to make. As Kennedy said, the ability to achieve peace depends on our own thinking even more than the other side. Depends on our own attitudes towards peace. And so this is why the work of this wonderful foundation is so essential. As Kennedy said, we are not gripped by forces that we cannot control. Our problems are man-made, and therefore they can be solved by man. This is a group that can help and is helping to decisively lead to the change of worldview. I can tell you outside there is every possibility of making peace. Peace with China is possible. Peace with Russia is possible. There are no implacable foes outside. Peace with Iran is possible. What they want is respect from the United States. What they want is not to be crowded by missiles and military bases and regime change operations and the CIA by the United States, and I couldn't agree with them more. So please, ladies and gentlemen, we have a lot of work to do. You are leaders. I'm with you, and I'm sure that we can change the trajectory and make a path towards peace. Thank you very much.